the reason why I think there's nothing casual about casual sex is because whether there are positive or negative consequences, there is definitely an impact. And so when I hear the word casual, what I'm assuming is like low stakes. What I'm assuming is like fewer containers. I'm assuming there's this kind of relaxed, and to me that feels really very misleading.
I like that containers. It's like I just want to say this is a soundbite. I really like containers.
So you know about like I have the worst ADHD.
I'm sorry,
the worst. Okay, so there's nothing casual about it. There are implications for casual sex, whether you are compartmentalizing in order to separate intimacy from physical pleasure, whether you are negotiating things with yourself or other people. In my opinion, there's nothing casual about it. And the thing about the research is that the research is pretty inconclusive. There are some studies that say it's healthy and it has positive outcomes. There are other studies that say that it's not so healthy and it doesn't have positive outcomes, right? But the point is that it's fraught and there's no kind of one way of looking at it, right? However, where I landed with this is that, and I think about this the way I would as an addict and an alcoholic, right? I like these studies may work out great for people who are maybe do not have addictive personalities, maybe do not have the sensitivities that I have. But as an addict and an alcoholic, my doing things that bring me pleasure, that has like, for me, that has like certain implications for my life, right? Like I have, for example, had casual sex dissociatively, right? Like I've just done it to like escape how I'm feeling, and maybe that's okay, right? But then I've also, I've had a history of like having sex compulsively, right? Where that has had negative consequences as well.
Yeah, I think that like, okay, so the only way I could possibly the only way sex can even be close to casual is if I do all the legwork leading up to it, meaning working my 4-step. And for those of you who don't understand the steps, there's a section in the 4-step that's about a sexual idea, but mainly an inventory and deciding how I've been showing up for sex. If I'm doing that consistently and I'm living my sexual idea that I've created as a result of understanding how I showed up, then it's making sure that I'm not going against the grain when I'm connecting with folks. Like if I'm hooking up with someone, like a big thing for me is if I'm hooking with someone who's not present, that's a problem, and that's going to cause me a problem beyond that. But I've had some of the best connections where it's a connected sex. We're not trying to be in a relationship. We may not do it again, but it's like I talked about before. I have the boyfriend experience where we are in this moment. We know exactly what this is. We are unafraid of communicating back and forth. And that's about as casual as it's going to get for me.
Right. You know, one of the things I have been trying not to do is I've been trying not to pathologize how I respond to a situation. Right. Like, for example, I have a lot of fear around closeness, especially like romantic closeness. And so much shit comes up for me. And I've had to be so careful not to like beat myself up for having a feeling.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think like around casual sex, like, I feel like one of the important distinctions that we have to make as like a queer recovery podcast is that I do think there is a distinction between the way the queer community has made allowances or has been flexible around parameters around sex and maybe say like the broader population.
Oh, absolutely. Because we don't necessarily like, it's like you were saying before, like we don't have like all of these amazing role models, examples of how to be in a queer relationship. And a lot of times I think what happens is that we try to, I'll just speak for this. We try to mirror what happens in a heterosexual relationship, and it doesn't always work because you've got two, whether it be 2 men, 2 women, 2, whatever. It's like the dynamics they're just not there. And also, depending on whatever other baggage you've brought into the situation, whether or not it's you believe that you are not worthy and you only believe that you are about sex and all that. There's so many like variables that come into play.
So that I think the distinction between, so already I'm already feeling like we do not have enough time to talk about everything that's like coming up. So we might have to have a sequel.
I think we should.
Yeah. So my first thought here is that although, okay, heterosexual people have had their relationships modeled for them for a very long time.
Yeah.
Now, let's not assume, for example, that those models have been perfect, right? And let's also not assume that there are straight people out there who are also learning how to define their own relationships. That being said, I also sometimes wonder, like, so sometimes I feel like there's a pressure for like polyamory, or there's like a pressure to be open, and I'm like, well,
in the gay community?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, at least like in a big city, right? I haven't had that experience in like smaller towns. Like where I'm from, gay men are not in open relationships.
Yeah.
Generally, where I'll hear like everyone and their mother's in an open relationship. And that's no judgment, right? Like no judgment there. I bring that up to say that sometimes I feel like there's like a pressure, right? Like there's a part of me that's like, well, Anthony, what is wrong with you that like you can't get around to it? But then also there's a part of me that's like, also gets confused because I'm like, oh, I've actually like under the right context, under the right situation, I could be in an open relationship. You know, I was talking to someone recently who was saying to me like, you know, Anthony, it's really about like security and safety. You know, like if you have that security and you have that safety with someone, then there are some certain things that feel like they don't really have like the same emotional charge, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. Right. And then there's also things like religion and culture and how that influences how we think about sex in our relationships to other people.
Yeah, I thought we had a comment.
We have a comment. Let's look at that. Stephanie Rinker says, don't mirror heroes.
Heroes.
I don't get it. What are you saying, Stephanie?
Explain, Stephanie.
Explain,
and we love you, Stephanie, even though you like to give me a hard.
Jaylon. Okay, Jaylon writes, I think the topic of casual sex and recovery is interesting because based off many shares that I've heard, the common denominator is us as a culture don't know how to have platonic relationships. Also, sex seems to be the thing that takes so many of us about.
Thank you, Jaylon. But you know what? I was going to make this comment. Okay, so like what you were saying about the pressure to be in. Okay, so my take is I don't think that a lot of people are in active open relationships. I think that they like the idea of open relationship, but I think that it requires a certain level of maturity from all parties, and that all parties don't really possess that. And what makes it even tough is like it's kind of like it is when we come into recovery. We're adults, and one of the things I had to relearn how to do was to load a dishwasher, and that was embarrassing. And I didn't want to say I needed to learn how to load a dishwasher. So if the embarrassment of saying that I can't handle conversations about sex or even being anxious like that, I mean, it requires a level of maturity that I think people don't have, you know?
Yeah. You know, one of the things is like, you know, the person I've been seeing now, we've had these like types of conversations, and they like every single time I feel so like I feel really like uncomfortable. You know what I mean?
Do you feel uncomfortable because you're like.
Well, let me finish.
Okay.
So like part of it is
Shut
like,
up, Lewis.
Yeah. It's like, you don't even know what you're responding to. So can I have like,
go ahead.
So like for me, because I have a lot of fear, right? Like I have so much fear just around closeness and intimacy, and like, you know, I have relationship wounding from previous relationships and like early like family of origin stuff. And so I think the thing that I fear the most is like the level of vulnerability that I am kind of like arriving with that makes me feel really sensitive. And in that is everything from like comparing myself to other people, to not feeling enough, to, you know what I mean? Like to feeling defective, which, you know, my container for that again is recovery. Like I still think I'm of the opinion that as an not an active addict, an alcoholic, but as an addict and an alcoholic, I have certain sensitivities. I have certain vulnerabilities, right? And as like someone who has like trauma in his history, like I also realize that I need to have like, I need to be good to my heart, You know, like I
Yeah.
need to be honest with myself. And like a lot of times that means like I have to say the uncomfortable thing, right? And so although a situation might make me anxious, like I have enough strength and wherewithal and enough support to actually kind of like face those things.
Absolutely.
You were going to say something?
Nothing.
Okay. So
No. I realize that, like, and sometimes, you know, and this is me self-correcting on air. Sometimes we have these conversations, and I realize we've had conversation before, and so I need to be mindful. I'm speaking about like as if we're continuing the conversation.
Yeah.
It's such a Virgo thing, you know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
well,
if you
we're
have
both
that.
Virgos. Yeah,
I know
yeah.
it's such a Virgo thing where it's like I can stop the conversation today and then pick it up 3 months from now.
I'm the same.
As if it's just
I'm the
like,
same.
and so it's
Yeah.
like, but we're also talking to other people, so I need to make sure that I let you finish your thought.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jaylon. I really appreciate your comments. Stephanie, I
Absolutely.
hope you're out there and thinking through your what we were asking you. Terry writes,
In early recovery, I had a hard time with intimacy. Without meth and alcohol, I found others in the room to practice with safely without strings. Good times. But, you know, I agree with that. There may not be the same kind of strings, but there are strings. But what I've been pretty fortunate, and I know it has to do with recovery, it's like being willing to say, like, okay, so I'm like what I talked about earlier, not wanting to be in a loving relationship. But when I first started hooking up, I would only hook up once because it was dangerously close to a relationship. And now I really like reconnecting because you get to know the person, but I'm open to having a conversation and you know, hey, let's have this conversation because I think it's unrealistic to think that like when you're becoming intimate in that way with someone on a continual basis and getting to know them, that you might cop some feelings and I can't shut them down. I mean, hell, maybe it's that I get to go in through the back door.
so
I get to go into a relationship through the back door. You know how some people wait.
Yeah. So this is interesting because one of the things that I've thought about is, okay, so in my history, one of the things that like I had to learn how to change in recovery is like when I was having sex, I was essentially teaching myself how to separate intimacy from sexual desire or sexual pleasure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that for such a long time that when I was finally in like a loving relationship or a close relationship, it was very hard for me to enjoy sex because I only knew sex as something that was emotionally detached. And so like now where I am in recovery is like I've been integrating those things, and that's like a very new experience, you know, and I have to ask myself, like what am I doing? Like what have been the consequences of casual sex, either positive or negative? And one of them is like, okay, like there are these things, like there are power dynamics involved when it comes to casual sex. Sometimes you might have someone who develops feelings, another person who doesn't. You might have one person who, like for example, I know I have a lot of people in my life who like anonymous sex, and for those people, like they are comfortable and prefer to not know the other person, so that it's strictly a sexual relationship, which to me is telling.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so no judgment there, right? I have to ask myself, is that a muscle that I want to develop? Do I want to develop a muscle where I separate sexual pleasure and intimacy, right?
I think it would be like, okay, so I'm sure that that's not what you're trying, but I think it'd be really challenging when you're trying to do what you're trying to do. Like it's challenging for us with like when we're performing this very delicate surgery to kind of reclaim ourselves, our sexuality, our all of that stuff. And yeah, no, there's a lot to go through.
Well, yeah, I wrote that down because I was like, like it's so like sometimes it just feels like the emotional fucking heavy lifting involved. Sometimes I have to ask myself, like, yo, like I only have so many years on earth. Like, is this really how I want to use my energy?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Go ahead. What were you
No, it's
say?
like I'm saying, it's like I've been sharing. I told the story about like COVID and hooking up my apartment or going to the sex club and how it has been confusing. I got to share in this room at a sex and intimacy meeting. And the point for me was that nowadays, you can have intimacy without sex, but you can't have sex without intimacy.
Interesting.
You absolutely.
Can you explain that?
Well, okay. So for me, like I, because of the work that I did, I absolutely need to. It's what we're talking about with the feelings and the connection, like the fact that it's not casual. I'm going to be affected every time, whether or not it's good, whether or not it's positive, and if it's not good, that even more so.
Right.
And so to think that I can go along, like you were saying, you were having this unconnected sex or whatever, and to think that that's not affecting me it's just not possible.
Right.
It's affecting me on a level that I may not know right now, but I'm gonna have to deal with it at some point.
Right. And I want to come back to what I was saying before about like the parameters in which I think about my sex and romantic life. I think about it as like an addict and an alcoholic. What do I know from my experiences? What I know from my experiences is that every single time I went out, I was involved in a relationship. There was like some type of like emotionally fraught, sexually charged relationship every single time. That's my story. Not everyone's story, but that was certainly my story.
And I'm envious of the people who don't have this problem.
Right. You know, and so that's like the first thing. I know that about myself. The other thing I know about myself is that I'm sensitive. You know, like I know that like I'm sensitive. I know that like emotionally charged situations can like drain me for days on end. You know what I mean? Like I know this about myself. I know that like my mental health is sensitive, you know, like I know that like I'm the kind of person who needs to go to meetings, who needs to do step work, who needs to have sponsees and commitments in order to feel contained. And so when I think about myself within that framework, right, just that, and then you add in like another human being, just that, another human being, number one, and then you involve like sex, and then you involve like romance or intimacy and all this other stuff. Like I have to think about like, is this pulling me away from recovery? Is this like healthy for my mental health? You know what I mean? Or is this taking me in another direction? And like, and the things that come up, what do I do with the things that come up? Right. But I would be remiss to not acknowledge that it is that complicated for me.
Exactly.
And if there are people out there for whom this is not complicated, please let us know how you do.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean? But like, it is certainly complicated for me. We have a comment. Terry writes,
go ahead.
You're right, Louis. I lied. There were always strings, but that was part of the learning too. It's hard, but I survived and stayed sober.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Terry.
And those strings are worth it. You know, I think that like you were saying, for me, what I'm learning the longer that I stay sober is that all of that stuff, which I agree with you, is that's a lot. But all of that stuff is my recovery. These are things if 100%. If I value them, or if something that I think is important, if I want in my right mind to have a solid, passion, you know, healthy kind of connection or whatever, I've got to do the work.
Right. And what I'm thinking of is,
oh, hey, it's Bonnie Violet.
Bonnie Violet.
Hi, Bonnie Violet.
So nice to see your beautiful face.
I know. Thank you.
When I think about recovery, and when I think, okay, so the thought that's coming to me is when you're first working the third step, right? And you start to picture like what God is of your understanding, right? And for me, when I was doing that, that was probably one of the coolest experiences I ever had, right? Like as a person in recovery, I also know that I can do the same thing with my relationships, right? I know that I can define my relationships. And sometimes there's like fear and trepidation in that. And I think one of the first things that has saved me is like just fucking being honest with myself. And sometimes being honest with myself is literally just saying like, this hurts me, or I'm uncomfortable, rather than trying to force myself to be somewhere other than where I am. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. No, it's like trying to do things for other people because you think that's what they want, instead of doing things for yourself. Yeah. Right. That's where I landed on my feelings about relationship, because I used to watch other folks, and I always thought that I needed that at this point in my recovery, I needed to be there. And the truth of it is I'm exactly where I need to be.
Right. And I love that. And what that brings up for me is that, and sometimes you don't need to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like sometimes you don't need to know. I feel like that's part of one of the like magical things about having a relationship with a power that's greater than myself, is that I know that my best ideas are not as good as like my higher
But you're
powers.
like Spock or Data. Your best ideas are pretty good.
Thank you.
No, we have a comment.
Let's hear it. Any tips for folks who do have casual sex in recovery? Absolutely. Thank you for that, Bonnie Violet. Let's start with you. Do you have any?
So I would encourage you to be, if you are working the steps consistently, if you are in 12 step, I think that it's really important to take your temperature. And the steps help us to take our temperature, but I think it's important to know where you are and really kind of understand what your motives for doing it. Like if you are feeling, sometimes we do it because we're feeling lonely, we feel like we need to be connected or whatever, or, we're just like, I used to tell myself, especially in active addiction, it's like, I am just a sex positive person when in fact I was just trying to fill an empty void.
Right. One of the things I want to add in response to Bonnie Violet's question is that if again, my opinion, if I pull the lens out and I'm just looking at sexuality for like what sexuality is, right? There really are no right or wrong reasons to have sex.
Absolutely.
Right? Like if you have sex because you're anxious, fuck it. If you have sex because you're lonely, fuck it. Like,
yeah, because you can still do,
right,
like Terry said, you can still do the work after.
Yeah, like you can do the work after, right? Like, of course, maybe it's less than ideal, whatever the fuck that means. But if I'm working a third step, I have to believe that everything that is happening is exactly as it should be. And if for example, I learn after a sexual encounter that like, hey, that didn't work for me, fine. Right. But like this idea that there's like maybe a right and a wrong way, I feel like that's not a good place to start. I think the best place to start is to believe, especially if you're in recovery. This is my advice to people in recovery. And if you're not in recovery, there's probably an adaptation to it, is to believe that whether it works out or it doesn't work out, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, that right or wrong, like you said, is going to cause them. I think that's what would cause me to be anxious because I want to do everything right. Yeah.
And I think some other practical things is like, don't fucking go at things alone. You know what I mean? It's like, is so, well, I knew you were going to go there. And after I said it, I was like, Anthony, you just like tossed Lewis a bone.
Thank you.
So, but basically is like, I think with everything and anything, it is so important for me to stay connected with the fellowship, with people I love, to not keep secrets. That's such a big
bone.
one.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, because it was like, I was like, oh, I feel like sometimes I walk right into stuff, but I think it's just so important to like stay connected with people, and it's like, and if you're having a fucking feeling, like there's no reason to call that feeling good or bad. Like just take that to a trusted friend, take it to a meeting, take it somewhere, like you don't have to kind of like suffer in silence and by yourself. So I think what I'm trying to say here is like, stay connected with people, be real about like what comes up for you.
Yeah.
And if it hurts, that's okay. You know what I mean? And if you feel like, for me, like what I wish someone would have told me, years ago is like, you know what, like if it's uncomfortable, it's uncomfortable. It doesn't need to have a reason, right? And you also don't need to be like talked in and out of things. I think that's
absolutely.
we have a comment.
Let's take it.
Terry writes, a frequent question from sponsees: how do you navigate confusing intimate friendships in the rooms with romantic relationships? Lewis and I, thank you for that, Terry. Lewis and I were actually just having that conversation. Do you want to go back to?
Okay.
So how do you navigate confusing intimate? So this is a good question. In my experience with this is like, I've had to think about that. The reason why I've had to think about it is because there was a time when I thought like, oh, like this is not something that impacts me, right? And I think this goes back to what Jaylon was writing before, right? What Jaylon was talking about, if I remember correctly, is this idea that like that forming friendships without like sex being involved or it being emotionally like charged in this way, like that's difficult. Okay. That being said, I think there is a way of navigating awkward relationships. The first thing is, I think, is just being honest. Like the first thing is naming it. Like this is uncomfortable, because I think what happens for some people, especially, people I know, is that they'll just pretend like nothing's happening, or they'll be uncomfortable and they'll gossip about it. And like, there's all this, and so it's like, you can take the energy out of a situation if you fucking just take that shit right to the person that you're having the issue with. That's the first thing. The second thing is kind of like a 10 step, right? If you're not familiar with 10 step, you like realistically, like if I was talking to a sponsee, like I need to look at that data. You know what I mean? If I did it once and it didn't work out and it was uncomfortable, like I need to learn from that situation, and I have to figure out a way. Okay, like what were the needs that I was trying to have met in that situation that didn't work out for me?
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I don't know. It's like, well, a lot of what you said is like right on. I used to always say, like, for me, and I'll compare it to a crush. You know what crushes are for me? I crushed them. Like I usually like I don't know. It's like I don't know that I've had that issue.
Well, can tell the people why you haven't had that issue.
I don't know. It's like I just okay. So I use the way that I've used the rooms. Like I've obviously had intense, not I want to say feelings or connections or been attracted to folks or whatever. But honestly, I just am like I've has this mantra. It's like all sex isn't good sex, and I really rely on don't dip your pen in a company ink. You know what? There are some places that I just don't need to do what I'm doing. You know, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, but for me, I hold this space for me sacred. Kind of like what I was talking about, my sacred bit. And as much as I would want to, like I flirt like crazy. I am an incurable flirt. I don't mind, but that's innocent. And there might be something in that where I was like, I'm not willing to go any further. I don't know if I'm a realist or whatever. If there's a situation where I'm really feeling somebody, I agree with you. Put it out there, talk about it. You know what? Or I talk about it ad nauseum with my sponsee or people that I trust. But a gift is always when you see that person with somebody else. I love that. It's like when you finally realize that, you know, this is what that is, you know. I don't even know if I'm landing on it because I was just speaking about it with you about, you know, I rely on you for actual like examples because
so I think so there's what comes up for me. The first thing that comes up for me is like, yes, I get that. We shouldn't shit where we eat. We shouldn't dip our pen in the company ink. I get that.
Oh, no. And let me qualify. No judgment, because I really feel like, you know, just like you find your relation, your connection, friendships or whatever, there is nothing wrong. I've seen some amazing relationships
absolutely
that start there. It's like there is no rule. There's absolutely no rule.
Yeah. So the first, absolutely. I agree. We're on the same page when it comes to that. And I think like the one thing I want to say is like, it happens. And it happens for good reason. It happens because we have a shared vocabulary in the rooms. It happens because we feel connected with each other. It happens because as gay men, they're like, that's a small community.
Yeah.
To be a sober gay man, that's a smaller community, and we are naturally going to gravitate.
To be a sober gay man in the Castro. That's an even smaller.
That's
community.
an even smaller community.
I think we have a comment. But
no, I think he was telling us that there were 5 minutes left.
Oh,
and there is a comment. Let's see it.
All right, now.
Jaylon writes, do you want to take that?
A problem for me has been trying to cultivate what healthy is for me. Casual hookups for me have always been tied to getting a need met. But now in recovery, I think that the transactionality of that doesn't sit well, because not only do I want to feel safe with the person that I'm having sex with, but I also want to remember they are a person too and not just an object. Absolutely.
Yeah. Jaylon, I can relate to that to the extent that I understand it.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about this next
week.
Yeah,
there's going to be a sequel. So the other thing I wanted to say, and then we have 5 minutes and we're going to continue on off air, and you just go to like all the things and find us for the rest of the conversation. But I like to think about recovery and the rooms as a spiritual sandbox, right? My friend Eric A in the rooms talks about like the spiritual sandbox. The reason why I like to think about it as a spiritual sandbox is because, like I was saying earlier, as like people who have like a shared vocabulary, who have like context, like a shared context, etc., that's a place like that is a safer space to have conversations. It's a safer space to maybe experiment or like explore like the best sides of yourself, right? In some cases, you know, like the rooms are generous enough where they allow you to be messy.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, but so that's like the first part is that like I think especially in recovery, you know, if you're gonna do something like commit to the thing that you're doing and just be upfront about it. I think I had another idea, but it just left me. Good and normal. Oh yeah, nope, that's it. Spiritual sandbox. So we have to start winding down. Brandon gave us because we have 3 minutes left. And,
yeah, this is one of those. I love conversations like this where we get into it.
So
the Castro Country Club is a safe and sober community center for all people and a refuge for the LGBTQ recovery community.
We provide programs and services that help people change their lives by supporting personal growth.
Our vision is to reduce the suffering of addiction by connecting people to community, opportunity, and support.
You can find more information, including all the ways to contact us at www.castrocountryclub.org/podcast.
Absolutely. And tune in every Tuesday at 4 p.m.-ish Pacific Standard Time. We go live in our Castro Country Club Facebook and YouTube channels.
Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Anthony LouiLou.
You read everything. Yeah. I really enjoyed the conversation.
It was really good. So we're going to go off camera. Like we've told you before, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation, find us wherever you get your podcast. And yeah, and until then, we'll see you next week. We'll be talking about casual sex and recovery part 2. Bye.